the sin. We were made in the mountains, now they're drawing us back. There's bells on the branches and paint on the track. We've marked out the way. We're not coming back.
Well, I think one thing I would say is that the assumption always is that seems to, and the objection that comes toward us, that animism is just a projection of human consciousness onto otherwise inanimate, insentient materials or beings. It does seem to be a kind of willful blindness and deafness to anything that doesn't speak in words. A sense that all of these other sounds are meaningless, rather than that they are voices that carry meanings that we humans cannot necessarily interpret or translate. We can't know in any easy way what these other voices, for instance, of bird song or even cricket rhythms, are saying, but nonetheless they do affect our bodies, they affect our state of mind and our mood, and
we're aware of them in other ways.
Indeed.
I mean, one of the things that I become more aware of over time as a speaker is the extent to which language acts as a frequency on which something else is being transmitted. That
Very
the
much so.
experience of the audience or of the other people with whom we are interacting is as much an experience of something else which is passing through the medium of words in the way that music passes through a string on a cello or on a guitar, as it is the rational, the formal content of language.
Yeah, it seems as if the denotative meaning of our words, even our words as we're speaking to one another just now, seems to ride on the surface of a much richer exchange that our two animal bodies are carrying on with one another, even in the sense that there is a rhythm and tonality and even a kind of melody to my speaking and to your speaking, where, well, there's a bidum and a babality to my speaking and your speaking, where our bodies are sort of singing to one another, almost like two birds or two other animals expressing themselves just via the sound and the meaning carried in the texture of our tongues. We affect one another, and so much of the meaning in so many human dialogues seems to probably ride in that depth of felt bodily expression, and the rational denotative meaning of the words rides on that depth like ripples on the surface of the sea or something like that. But also, I was thinking that so many of our brothers and sisters who will insist that, human consciousness is so profoundly different from anything else we encounter in the surrounding landscape, and that a sense of the animateness or spontaneous life in other animals, in plants, even in a mountain, or in the gusting wind, is just a projection. Their insistence that the world sort of be seen from outside, as it were, by a human consciousness that isn't really continuous with
that
the world.
Echoes the role of God in a monotheistic cosmology.
It does. And it flattens all of this diverse, multiplicitous otherness into just one thing. It's just all sort of inanimate or mechanical matter. While as soon as we allow that things have their own agency or their own interior animation, their own pulse, so to speak, then it becomes possible to actually notice how richly different these various beings are from one another and from ourselves. If I insist that rocks have no life or agency whatsoever, then I can't really suss out the way a slab of granite feels very, very different to me than a slab of or a boulder of sandstone near my home. But as soon as I allow that, of course, it does have some ability to affect the space around it and to affect me, that it's not entirely inert, then I can begin to account for the very different style of activity of that sandstone from the granite or from the piece of marble. So this is really a way of beginning to access the irreducible plurality and multiplicity of otherness that surrounds us on every hand, rather than reducing it all to one flat thing, the environment.
And it feels like what we're talking about are ways of seeing, to use John Berger's phrase, or ways of sensing, because it's not just about the visual. But that kind of takes me to something that I was thinking about before. I wanted to tell you about a painting. It's a painting from 1649, and it's of a man called William Petty, who was professor of anatomy at the ripe age of 27 here in Oxford in 1649. And I'm fascinated by this painting. I stumbled across it randomly in the National Portrait Gallery years ago. And in the painting, he's holding a skull in one hand, and in his other hand is open an anatomy textbook with a drawing of a skull. And from where the hands are, it's like you're watching the scales of the 17th century tipping away from the symbolic and the physical real skull towards the quantitative, measured, anatomized, cut open to reveal its mathematical properties, new reality.
Which is then projected entirely on the flat surface of the page. Right.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that he stands, that Petty as the anatomist stands between two other phases of Petty's life. Before that, during the Civil War, he had been hiding out in Paris, keeping away from trouble, with Hobbes. And Petty and Hobbes were studying optics together in Paris in the 1640s. And this is the moment where, and Illich talks about this, you go from this earlier optics, which assumes that the gaze is this thing which goes out from the seer and touches. Illich talks about the gaze as an erectile organ, to this new lens-based, passive, receptive understanding, which sort of sees our eyes as cameras in our heads.
Yes.
And so that was what Petty was doing before he was here as Professor of Anatomy. Wow. And what he was doing after that in the 1650s was that he went with Cromwell to Ireland to do the first ever econometric survey of Ireland after the bloody subjugation of Ireland by Cromwell's forces. And so you have in this one figure this kind of conjunction of the transition to a new way of seeing, the anatomical cutting open of reality to reveal the mathematical new reality hidden behind the untrustworthy evidence of our senses, and the foundation of modern economics, of this new way of looking at the world, which is founded in the assumptions, the same assumptions about the measurable being the real, and with that, the fundamental character of reality is scarcity. And I just wonder whether, I don't wonder, it's obvious that there is something that's bound up together.
Indeed.
Between those, and what the interesting connection I hadn't thought of before was when we were talking about language, the formal content of language and the substantive context of language, mapping onto what Polanyi talks about, the formal economics, which seeks to describe reality in the same way that the anatomy textbook describes reality, and the substantive economics, which sees our economic activity not as this kind of physics or biology level of natural reality underlying the social and the cultural, but as something that's bound up with and dancing with
Indeed.
the social and the cultural.
Indeed. Beautifully said. Yeah.
So I don't know quite where that takes us next, but...
Oh, that's lovely. And it's amazing to think of that one painting as sort of...
this icon.
Presenting an image of the hinge between these
exactly.
realities. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose where it does take us next is back to how on earth we relate this to the sense of urgency which characterizes environmentalism and characterizes the consciousness of the crises we're facing. Because what I hear people saying, sometimes directly to me and Paul and sometimes more generally, is, come on, we've got 5 years to save the planet, or whatever the latest kind of diagnosis is. It's hard enough getting people to change their bloody light bulbs, and you want to try and upend 350 years of people's world views. This is self-indulgent.
Right.
And what do we say back?
It's a tough one, because it is trying to speak across such different stances, bodily stances, in the face of what really, there's no denying something outrageous and huge is breaking upon us and breaking over our species and rolling like a huge wave over the earth, and probably a huge series of waves. But certainly the idea that we can master it and just control it and figure out how we're going to just engineer our way out of this mess is an extension of the very thinking that has brought us into this.
Yeah, I mean, the 5 years to save the planet thing, to me, that says we have a choice. Either we can get control of this system which is reeling out of control,
yes,
or we have to give in to despair.
Exactly.
And to me, what I've been looking for and what Dark Mountain is rooted in is the search for hope without control.
Yes.
And I know at the level of my human experience that actually it's only when I let go of control that I can find a deep hope as opposed to a wishful thinking. Yeah,
but also the insistence that, okay, we've got 5 years, or we've got 20 years for that matter, or 12, or it's all, look, we just have 2 years to actually turn this thing around. But these are always framed within the mindset of a linear time that itself is very different from the kind of time or timing that the land itself inhabits, and that the other animals live within this kind of sense of the roundness of time that our bodies also are well acquainted with, though our minds have become massively alienated from. But the round dance of the seasons, the cycling of the sun and of the moon as it goes through its various phases, certainly there's no way out of this mess without at least beginning to recouple our senses into the larger body of the sensuous, without beginning to tune ourselves and our nervous systems back into these larger cycling systems. Well, systems is really a lousy word for it, but but there's a sense in which sensory perception itself is a kind of glue that binds our separate nervous systems into the wider ecosystem by beginning to notice and taking the time to slow down rather than speed up to meet the urgency, but to slow down to notice
Yes.
what is actually unfolding in the local landscape, even if it's the cityscape that we inhabit, but to notice the small nuances of what's breaking through the pavement in this spot, or where the pigeons are nesting, or why these apples taste so much more tasteless than they did when I was growing up, and what that's about, and what that says about the soils in which these apples are growing. I can't, find the time to actually attend to those tastes if I'm motivated so much by a sense of...
By urgency and by this definition of time running out. And
exactly.
I think, though, that way of framing things as well is bound up with the desire to escape from the limits of our knowledge. When we say we've got 5 years,
yes,
part of what we're doing there is performing a ritual of pretending that we can know with greater certainty than we actually can, because we're afraid of the degree of uncertainty involved in these situations. And I mean, one of the phrases from the manifesto which I've held on to most is from right at the end. We say, "The end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop." And I'd add to that the end of the world as we know it is also the end of a way of knowing the world.
Nice.
And at that point,
Very
for
nice.
me,
Very nice.
Whatever happens, to the extent that we are still going to be here, the way of knowing the world which has served us during these last few centuries, and which has brought a certain particular kind of abundance, an abundance of production within a narrow definition of that. Whatever happens, we're going to live through the end of a lot of the certainties and the ways of knowing which characterised that. And that's not a utopian goal. That's something which is going to happen whether or not we manage to do anything about climate change.
That's right. And as these very conventional, long-term conventional ways of knowing begin to spring leaks, well, many of them are already just cracking apart, and the leaks are turning into floods. But this also then suggests replenishment of much older and deeper, and in many cases much more primordial sensibilities that we'd cut ourselves off from for many centuries, in some cases for many millennia. But how do you approach the fact or the aspect of this turning point that also entails that there will be many losses, not just of easy and facile pleasures that we've come to take for granted, but losses within the life world of other species, other creatures who with whom we've practiced a kind of conviviality throughout the whole stretch of human tenure here on this planet. It would seem that that we are living in a world of increasing wounds.
Yeah.
And I know that in my work, which involves trying to invite people to come yet closer to their animal bodies and to identify more fully with their own animality and wake up their animal senses and wake up within their skin and begin thinking with their senses and thinking with their whole skin awake, and feel out those forms of reason or reflection that are appropriate to a full-bodied creature inhabiting this living, breathing mysterium we call Earth. But it's very difficult often to bring this across to folks who will often come up to me and say, but, David, I'm really frightened to step into such a full-bodied way of feeling, or to really begin to pay heed to my
because to step
experience.
into that is to experience a loss which our disembodied Cartesian way of being in the world anesthetizes us to.
It numbs us to.
Yeah.
And so to actually become, at ease with one's own animal flesh is, at first, it seems, to awaken
to loss.
To a great deal of loss, to many grievous losses. And people sense that grief, and they immediately retreat. They immediately pull back and say, "No, I want to stay more in the abstract, or I want to retreat yet further into technology and its virtual pleasures," because they very rightly sense that there is some grief lurking on the hither side of such a of such a transition. But I think what you know, and what your work and Paul's work is also seeking to bring out, and mine as well, is that grief is it's a kind of threshold.
Yeah.
And it's a necessary threshold through which one needs to step. And the first moment is one of, of coming into my senses, is one of, and letting the grief flow. In some sense, even I think the soil needs our tears. It needs that water for things to begin to grow again.
Well, the soil of ourselves needs us to go through that.
Yes.
But
one goes through it into fairly rapidly, it seems to me,
into being alive and being present.
Alive and present, and very pleasurefully nourished by a whole host of relationships that one suddenly finds oneself engaged in, with the ground underfoot, and with the air flooding in at one's nostrils, and with the other plants around it, even with the stony walls of the buildings in one's town.
Even with the city walls of Oxford.
Even with these city walls here. All suddenly you find yourself in being nourished by these relationships, and there's a kind of joy that
I think it's
accessible.
about a different relationship to time.
Indeed.
I think that part of the numbness of the way of being in the world which has been orthodox in recent times is the enslavement of the present to the future, which to me is core of the myth of progress.
Indeed.
It's the Protestant work ethic, but it's so many layers deeper than we normally think about it as being. And so when people kind of attack Dark Mountain for being gloomy and pessimistic because we don't believe in progress, it bemuses me, because to me, believing in progress is absenting yourself from the joy of being alive now.
In the present moment.
And it's also partly, the denial of death, which is characteristic of modern culture. And so part of the reason we have so much difficulty facing the ecological grief that is part of what it means to be alive and conscious at the moment we happen to be here is because we are terrified of our own deaths. We have not come to terms with that, and so much of the activity which characterizes our societies is a way of staying busy enough not to pass through the full entry into consciousness of the fact that you are going to die, and that does not cancel out what makes being alive good, which has been part of, as far as I can tell, all of the stages of the journey through life in just about any other time and place than places which fall under the domain of this peculiar way of knowing and being in the world that we've inherited.
Yes, I think you're right. I think there's also, in some ways, it's not only a fear of death, or a terror of death, but also a kind of terror just of vulnerability, a real fear of being vulnerable in the present moment. If I'm fully embodied or fully here, where my fingers and lips and ears are residing, I'm then subject to a world that is much, much bigger than me, with other beings in it like yourself, whose gaze can see me and perhaps disdain me. I am vulnerable to the scorn of others. I'm vulnerable as a body, as an embodied creature, to all sorts of pains and decays and breakdowns and illness and losses, the loss of loved ones around me. There are so many reasons to flee or take flight from being deeply here and deeply a part of the very world that we share with the other animals and with the plants. So yes, I think a fear of our mortality, a fear of really being inside of and a part of something so much bigger than us that can eat us and ultimately will eat us. I mean, the palpable world, this earthly blooming, buzzing, wild proliferation of shapes and forms that feed on one another and yet also converse and dance and
play
and play delightedly with each other and with one another. It's
so how do we find our way back?
I wonder. Yeah.
Something that came to me suddenly.
But just to say that this world is not. It's not the world that your work, that my work, and our play as well, is trying to coax people into noticing, is not a particularly nice world.
Okay.
It's not a sweet world.
It's not a Disney world.
Not at all. It's not particularly sentimental or sweet. It's dangerous. In fact, it's fucking dangerous. And it's, but it's very beautiful.
Yeah.
It's deeply beautiful because it is so shadowed and rife with
it's not easy,
difficulty.
but it's worth it. In the same way, easiness and happiness are things that we seem to, and convenience are things we seem to have fallen into the habit of believing are worth pursuing.
Yeah.
And yet, if we think about our most meaningful relationships, the people we love most closely, even if we set aside how often we have relationships which are genuinely damaging and broken and dysfunctional, even the best of our relationships are not characterized by easiness, and they're not characterized by everything being happily ever after, and they're not characterized by most of the relationships we have in our lives are easier than the relationships which will mean most to us.
Right.
And that
and those
holds
are
for
hard.
our relationship to reality as well.
Indeed.
And Yeah, the thing I was thinking of a moment ago. Last year, I was sat in a cottage in Devon, gone away for a few days with some friends, and I was on my own, lighting a fire, and then sitting there in front of this fire for nearly an hour, watching it, getting it going, feeding it. And it suddenly struck me that there are certain activities which have a particular hold on us because they go generations deep.
Yeah.
Most of the activities which we take part in, you know, when I'm sat there checking my email on this amazing tiny computer that's sat in my pocket, that's an experience which is not a quarter of a generation deep.
Right.
And it's great, but there is something wonderful in the way that old friendships are wonderful about the fact that there are certain experiences, you know. And so ever since then I've been looking for these, and I've been thinking of it as kind of the generation game. And I'm trying to find somebody who's more visual than me to collaborate with, to find a way of actually making this into something that we can share with other people. But the two other ones that have really come out at me, one was sitting in a park with friends, watching the way that everybody watches dogs play together. And going, yeah, that's as deep as the last ice age, when humans and dogs started hanging out together. And that's something that's really there in some way because of the number of generations. And then my friend Pete brought his 3-month-old baby to the pub. And Woody, his baby, was sat on the table, and there were 8 of us sat around this table, and everybody's attention was just held by this child in the way that kind of TV very superficially holds our attention. It was the same kind of focus, gravitation, but it wasn't superficial, it was deep.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is mammal deep.
Indeed it is.
And I wonder if these kind of experiences might be a route back, because however disconnected from our bodies we are, in the moments where we have these experiences, it rings a bell somewhere very, very deep, and it pulls us into that longer chain.
Yeah, we feel it in our bones. Certainly, gazing into a fire, simple act of walking, I think, carries something of that for all, and the way the whole landscape shifts around us as we walk. Baking bread is not mammal deep, but it's real old.
Yeah.
Within our
thousands of years.
Within our species. But and I suspect there are so many others that we would begin to notice. They're so close to us that
this is what I'd love to invite people from their different experiences and their different specialisms to bring these stories and to begin to map in some way that you could walk through and experience the kind of the variation in depth of the different experiences and activities.
Very, very cool. But you just touched on what I think is a really major one of these, which is the act of storytelling itself and the act of hearing a story, but not hearing it over the radio or through the screen of a computer or of a television. Although there's something obviously very atavistic and old in the way the flickering screen of the television, sparkles that sitting around a fire and gazing at while listening to a story. But to actually now and then find ourselves sitting around fires and telling stories, or at least sitting in a good warm room at the heart of winter and exchanging tales with one another, functional stories, not just stories that that are rollicking good yarns that are fun to pass on, but actual stories
that give us maps.
Yeah, stories that
to navigate by.
Exactly, that carry information that our bodies can use in navigating our way through this curious moment in the world or through the particular terrain where we live. Stories about just what happens inside the forest edge every full moon, or how the river feels when the salmon return to its waters. Stories that hold us or call us back into right relation or some kind of reciprocity with the other beings and powers and elements that structure the place where we live. Beginning to share such stories again. I think this is so old in our species, and it is so culturally rich. It's almost like dropping into the deep taproot of culture itself and beginning to sort of tap these essential nutrients that are necessary for any kind of rejuvenation and replenishment or transformation of culture that we wish now to begin to bring about. You have to drop beneath these recently sedimented layers into these old, deep, sort of the deep humus in which our humanity is rooted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's one story that I've been thinking about at points while we've been talking, which I think has really shaped the environmental movement, and which I have this very ambivalent relationship to, which is the story which Stuart Brand started telling in the 60s about the whole Earth, and which has evolved a temporal dimension as the long now as well, and which gave us the icon of environmentalism, this image of the Earth from space. And I remember when I first heard about the Whole Earth catalogue, without thinking about it very much, I just sort of assumed it was whole in the same sense as Whole Foods and wholesome and so on.
Yes.
And then I learned that there was this much more specific story, which was Brand talking about this vision he had that, if only NASA would release the pictures of the whole Earth from space, it would kind of facilitate this transcendence of human consciousness where we would be able to see our fragility and, that we were all one, that we were all in it together on spaceship Earth.
Right.
And I just, I think, and I'm really interested in the sort of counterpoint, in a sense, between Brand and his influence and Illich.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't know much about it, but I know that they were, friends and collaborators to a degree, in the sense that Brand published Illich's work over a long period of time and they corresponded, but also they seem to represent not quite opposites that one has to choose between, but the feeling I get from Illich is that, I don't think he ever quite says this, but he says something close to it at the end of Deschooling Society, that getting to the moon is the easy bit, it's coming back that's hard. And it's
so true. It's so right.
And that story has been so influential and continues to be so influential over environmentalism, and it contains within it a sense that the solution to our problems lies in more distance, in zooming out further, in greater alienation. And again, I think that the counter movement that I get from Illich, and which I think for me is very strong in your work, is this pull back, saying that at many levels the problem that we face is that we are too alienated, too zoomed out. So I don't know, because I don't want to. Well, so the long now version of this moves from it being about space to about time, and so the Long Now Foundation invites people to think for 10,000 year time horizons, and I feel a lot of common ground with a lot of the people who are drawn to it. We have great conversations, but there's a subtle difference between thinking for 10,000 years and the thinking for 7 generations
It's
tradition.
very different. It seems to me very, very different.
Yes.
You rightly, bring up how so much of environmentalism today is still focused on getting to a particular future. But that future is always then a mentally envisioned or constructed future, which we then project off into the distance. And so it holds us in a kind of detachment from what is actually unfolding immediately around us in the subtlety and richness of the present moment, from which I've been estranged ever since I stepped into the education system of my culture. I have learned to get more and more alienated from the present moment. So the question is, are we trying to get to the future, or are we trying to find our way back into the present moment from which we have been so estranged by our civilization and its confusions? That is, back into the same world inhabited by these oak trees and the ravens and the wolves, so that we begin to feel ourselves as participants once again in this larger community of life. It's not at all about going back to the past, but rather in some sense coming full circle, beginning to step back inside the cycling of time.
And I see this in, there is a real sense which, once people sit and think about it, is kind of culturally quite obvious that the future has broken, that the future doesn't occupy the role in our societies and our cultures that it did even in the 1950s and 60s, with the weight of mutually assured destruction hanging over people. There was nonetheless a kind of an ability to lean on the future, whether that was in terms of belief in technological progress or belief in the possibility of revolution or whatever it was.
Yes.
And that has mysteriously evaporated. And it leaves, I see two kind of common responses. There's a sort of postmodern response, which is, we'll worry about it later.
Right.
And there's a kind of a nostalgic modernism, which has a desire to reboot the future, to get that working again, to make technology offer us a promise that will get us out of our slump and our postmodern meaninglessness. And my sort of alternative to that I'm kind of feeling my way towards is to say that there was already, and this is kind of what we've been talking about anyway, but there was already something deeply broken or deeply under strain about the attitude to the future which characterized, industrial, capitalist, modernity, whichever set of labels we want to give to it. That there was a harnessing of desire such that to be a good economic citizen became to work hard today for a deferred reward.
Yes.
And in that you lose the festive culture where a surplus is an excuse for the animal experience of a feast, rather than a surplus being something to be rationally reinvested. So you have that, and Victorian morality is in a sense just the playing out in sexual culture of the relationship of time and desire, which is inaugurated by an economic culture which is oriented around deferred gratification.
Yes.
And then at a certain point in time, in the developed countries, to be a good economic citizen begins to shift from being a good producer to being a good consumer. And so what you have is you spend on your credit card today and worry about how you're going to pay for it tomorrow. And that is itself just another abstract contortion
Yes.
of the relationship between desire and time, because it says, your desires are self-authenticating. There is no distance between yourself and your desires. It is good to act on your impulses.
Right.
And meanwhile, you are being trained in what impulses to act on.
Yes.
And so...
Well said, yeah.
So somehow we have to find a way to a humbler, more ambiguous, richer, more plural relationship to time that is neither of those kind of one-size-fits-all of relationships between time and desire, which is not the future which justifies the hardship of the present, but which is a being in the present in relation to the future and in relation to the past.
Yes.
And part of the reason that we look at the stone walls of the city and are awed by them is because we see not just what's there now and the patina of centuries on it and the growths on it, but we also see the craftsmanship of the men who put those stones together, and we see the vast distances of time and the processes which put those stones together and the things which they were put together from long before there were animals like us sitting around having conversations like this.
Indeed, indeed. So it's as though coming more deeply into the presence of the present is to awaken to
the simultaneity of time.
Yeah, to a sense that the present is vast.
Yeah.
And has a kind of eternity.
And it's accommodating, it's hospitable.
It's hospitable. It has room for many, many depths. In fact, inexhaustible worlds within worlds within worlds. Mm-hmm. Some of which just open onto a horizon beyond which we cannot see. And there are near horizons and more distant ones. The near horizon just behind that big maple across the way. I can't see the other side of it. And at any moment some squirrel might come running out. But there's also the more distant horizon behind the wall or behind the edge of the ocean out there. But the present is vast. It opens onto that fullness, and it also has within it, it's supported by the density of a ground that has all sorts of depths and dimensions and layerings within it that I can, they've sedimented the different eras, the different moments of history have layered themselves so thickly that I'm able to now lie down upon this ground, or we can sit upon it, and upon all of those ancestors whose bones may make up this ground and this soil, and
we
can
can rest on the past and look into the future.
Yeah.
Without the strain between them.
If we feel how richly the past is supporting us, and those ancestors are also here, whether beneath us, in the ground, in the air, in a sense, all around us, in these trees and the walls of these old buildings, and how those to come are also present with us and listening toward us, questioning, beckoning from just beyond the horizon or from just behind that tree. So the other moments of time are here in some sense when we get really here. But if we're so caught up in the strain and urgency of getting somewhere else, if we're not really here in this place, then we're cut off from all those other places and all those other times. It's only by being deeply here that we're connected to all those other times.
We don't have to produce the future. The future is coming of its own accord.
Or it bubbles in some way out of just
Yeah,
what
or
we're doing by being deeply here.
The future is a byproduct of the present, not a product.
Yeah, it's a,
Maybe.
or it's a, it feels to me like something that is bubbling out unexpectedly, in ways that we can't predict, out of the quality and depth with which we're able to meet one another and these other creatures or these other beings around us, but also and especially the other humans, who we find ourselves in interaction with, whom it falls to us to lend a hand to, or to enter into conversation with. But there's a kind of exquisite, if I'm really here, I have to improvise to enter into conversation with you. And I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth, and you don't know what's going to be drawn out of your mouth by my ears, and something is born between us. It seems to me that's the future is born by people and other beings being deeply of the present moment and meeting one another with their full depth of presence.
And being open to the unknown.
Yeah. And being open to the otherness and the unknown that meets me in the person of Dougald here. That's somehow it's the encounter with otherness, it seems to me, and the ability with which I'm able to meet that, which only happens in the full presence of the present moment, and that's the magic out of which a genuine future or a genuine sense of possibility and metamorphosis arises. That's the real work, it seems, of cultural metamorphosis, is being deeply present to one another, not being absent to one another because we've got some constructed image of a future that we're trying to make happen or conjure.
Dave, there are so many more things that we could talk about, but I'm sure there will be many more conversations when we can do so. But thank you.
Well, I wanted to just say that there's this there's an astonishment that comes when, after finding one's own way into a style of thinking and feeling and expressing the world that is so different from the conventions around one and from the ways that are affected by so many of one's fellow citizens, one begins bumping into other folks in other places who seem to have stumbled by their own route into the very same logic, the very same body of hunches and intuitions and insights, but from their own angle.
Yes.
And or it's almost as though I've stumbled and bumbled my way into a thick forest in which I've then gotten lost because I can't find my way out, and I have no interest in finding a way out. But then bump into others also wandering within the same woodland.
Having come by different paths from different directions.
Exactly. And at which point it becomes entirely unimportant what route or what road one took or what trail one was following to get in there. It's just that we're there and we're inside the same wild woodland, and there's a terrific sense of gratification and pleasureful wonder that comes from realizing that this is a shared place, and it's
Yes, that it's
shared
not
by
just
many.
a creation of the imagination
Right.
and some elaborate construct, but that it's a map which corresponds well to things which you then experience, and therefore people who are constructing maps starting from different material arrive at similar maps.
Yeah. Well, my sense is that it's much more a terrain than it is a map. It's a map only in the sense that the terrain is a map of itself. It's a landscape that.
It's a landscape that lies all around us.
It lies that we inhabit it with our bodies, with our whole bodies, and that's why I don't think of it entirely as a map.
Yes.
It's something we're in. It's not something we look at and can objectify or sort of get a complete any complete approximation of, or even put on the flat surface like a map or a screen. It is something we inhabit with our whole organism, and it's a realm that seems curiously to be inhabited by many other organisms as well. But the pleasure and the wonder is that other humans, born into the same exceedingly goofy civilization that is so confused and in conflict with its senses,
stumble into such similar territory and encounter each other and go, what, you mean you noticed that too?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just one of my favorite experiences, and it is the sensation I first had when I happened to bump into the Dark Mountain group, and I have it much more strongly in meeting you and hearing you speak and entering into conversation with you. I think that's a wonder, and it says something about magic too, because this landscape, this terrain, if we call it that we both find ourselves in which we know we have many other sisters, we have many other brothers, and elders as well within this place, and even ancestors who've been here long before, who have marked out certain trails within the wood that we can now
We find ourselves following and exploring and branching off from.
Yeah, but magic, just how, in the sense of, in the sense that it's another logic. It's a very, very different logic from that to which we were educated, and yet it is a logic, or one might call it a logos, in the sense that it's a logic that one inhabits with one's whole body. Yeah.
Yes, and that logic that we were educated into was itself magic. You know,
in a very unfortunate sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you dig back and you find figures like John Dee standing at the back of the account of reality which we've been talking about and distancing ourselves from. And you find that, in a sense, yes, once it's been brought into being, the quantitative scientific worldview is internally coherent and can present itself as emerging from nature. But the project which brings it into being is a conscious cultural project which runs through several generations in the 17th century in places like Oxford, where we're sitting, and which forms a particular powerful, coherent way of approaching reality, which produces results of a sort, but which also polices a boundary of what can be said to be real, which has no foundation that comes from within its logic, but that boundary is pre-logical.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we're just broaching the edge of a whole huge topic
terrain that we could,
but that we don't want to wander into because I have to go. Something I know I do want to reflect on with you, and it doesn't have to be recorded at all, but my bemusement and curiosity at finding my own sense of magic and the tradition in which I find myself. But it seems to run very, very counter to, or cutting across at a very oblique angle, the Western esoteric and occult and magical traditions, which I don't find much affinity with. Although there are elements and there are streams and strains within them, subterranean streams that I can locate.
But they have so much in common with the thing that we are critiquing, and they pick up and amplify so many of the habits which are characteristic of that.
So there's a sense, some people, spiritually minded folk who are tracking on esoteric traditions, often speak of it being one big common tradition, the perennial tradition, as it's sometimes called and such. But this, it doesn't seem right to me, or the so-called perennial tradition seems deeply at odds with the much more embodied and animistic sensibility common to the old ways, the ways of so many very, very different and very distinct and weirdly different from one another indigenous traditions of the world, each one borrowing its particular textures from the particular ecology of its locale, and yet they seem to share certain common aspects and threads that are very, very different.
It's a commonness which doesn't seek to arrive at a universal abstract statement.
Exactly.
And the thing which you're reacting against in the Western tradition is the same thing which we're reacting against in science, which is a tendency towards literally utopian thinking, thinking which is not grounded in a topos, in a place.
Exactly.
And this is the thing for me which Oxford embodies at its worst, and which places like Blackburn Trust that we were talking about earlier, where Alan Garner and his wife and their friends have created this amazing space. They're beginning to know on the assumption that place matters, and to reground our knowing, which is also regrounding our knowing in being embodied, which is what Ivan Illich was talking about in the Vineyard of the Text.
Yes.
That, and the possibility that the rupturing of our way of knowing and being in the world, which is a crisis, is also an opportunity to reconnect, not in a rewinding sense to that. I think that's where the hope begins. I think your taxi's here.
Okay, great. Thanks,
David. It's wonderful to meet you.
Really great.
I'm like I say, I'm going to be over to the States this winter, so I look forward to. But I'll be in touch.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Great.
And have a safe journey.
Thank you.